we also had some group coaching, was how they would all have this light bulb moment of, wow, you guys are all like facing the same issues that I am. And I kind of thought you all had it all figured out, but you don't. And it makes me feel a lot better that I'm not out here in an island and I haven't quite figured out the solution to X, Y, and Z. But then we figured it out together. And one of the things that I think came up frequently was this feeling of, as they became successful over time, moved up the organization, so on and so forth, they lost touch a little bit with themselves or maybe who they were.
All right, welcome. So, hey, everybody, welcome to another great interview here on the Habitual Growth Podcast. It's my pleasure to introduce Todd. Todd and I were connected actually by one of the co-founders here, Lisa, who used to work with Todd, obviously, and is a partner of mine, is also my sister. But Todd, tell us who you are, what you're doing these days.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. I appreciate it. I guess for your honest identification, I don't know who the heck I am, so I might as well say a few words. So a little bit about me. I spent, holy mackerel, 30 years ish in corporate America. And for a large percentage of that time, I worked for a Fortune 200 medical device company where I was a global leader for a variety of different functions. It would be regulatory affairs. I did a lot of work in clinical research and so on. And what was really interesting for me, especially that last 5 years, I mean, it was a great company. It was a great experience for me all around, really some life-changing mission, which was very, very rewarding. That last 5 years, they asked me actually to start coaching some of our senior directors and our vice presidents in the organization who were part of a differentiated development program. Like, look, these are the future leaders that are going to be our general managers, potentially some XCOM members, and we'd like you to help coach them. I'm like, okay, you remember who you're talking to here, right? So it was a great experience. I actually became a certified coach as a part of that process. And it was in addition to my day job, right? I was still running a clinical research function. And what's interesting to me as I'm working with these vice presidents is it didn't matter what function they came from, what business unit maybe they were a part of, or where they were in the world. We had one-on-one coaching, and we also had some group coaching. Was how they would all have this light bulb moment of, wow, you guys are all like facing the same issues that I am, and I kind of thought you all had it all figured out, but you don't. And it makes me feel a lot better that I'm not out here in an island and I haven't quite figured out the solution to X, Y, and Z. But then we figured it out together. And one of the things that I think came up frequently was this feeling of, as they became successful over time, moved up the organization, so on and so forth, they lost touch a little bit with themselves or maybe who they were. And while they were sort of successful, they also didn't always feel great about maybe how they were leading or how they showed up, and wanted to be different, but didn't even know maybe what that part of them that they had lost was. So this is one of the things that we would spend some time on. And since I've left corporate America, I work with executives and executive teams now as part of the work that I do in a company called Thriving 9 to 5. And that's one of the places we occasionally will lean into. And what I find is the most fulfilling leaders, and I like using that word because successful could mean a whole bunch of things, but I think the ones that are most fulfilled are the ones who are able to remember, okay, what's that? And it's certainly an overused word, authentic part of me that maybe I've lost touch with. And then how do I not maybe hide it? Because I've sort of been taught to, or at least I think I have been over the years, but how do I even bring that forward and become not only professionally more successful, but also just more fulfilled? I feel good about myself and the leader.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I'm glad you made that segue into that because there were so many different topics that we could have chose to talk about today. I know you've talked about authenticity probably ad nauseum, but it's such an interesting topic that almost has this stigma to it, right? It almost
For sure.
sounds too goofy or silly to discuss, especially at high levels. Cause like you said, a lot of people feel like they lost something. They don't know what something actually is. So really kind of starting out today, when we talk about authenticity, what does that mean to you? What do you oftentimes see when you hear or when people start to understand the word authentic?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up because you're right. I feel like it gets brought up a lot, and you hear people say, "Oh, they're really authentic," or "I'm not allowed to be authentic," or "I can't be my true self," or whatever. So it's a great place to start. And I'll tell you what it isn't first. And I hear a lot of people say, "Well, I can't be myself at work because I like to tell jokes," or "This is who I am," and they don't like who I am, then tough. But really, that's not authenticity. It's bad boundaries. And I guess what I would call sort of personality, right? It just has
Mhm.
nothing to do with being authentic. It's really an excuse, I think, for not understanding boundaries and behavior. So for me, authenticity really has a couple of key pieces that are associated with it. And those are resonance and fidelity. And I'm happy to chat about each one of those with you if you want to dive in deep here.
Yeah, please. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so resonance. And maybe the best way to think about this is through an example. So, being a corporate American, I'm sure, and I know some of your history too, you've probably been in situations where there's a reduction in force or
Mhm.
downsizing, and
Yep.
this happens, and there are all sorts of right sizing or whatever you want to call it. They get some polished name. And usually, what happens as a leader is these are the decisions maybe that you have to make, but they're the ones that you have to implement. Okay, leaders have to do that. It's fine. Sometimes you've made these decisions as well. But in a large company, a lot of times what you end up getting is a script, right? The HR folks will hand this, and the communications folks will hand you the script of here's the talking points, here are all the questions employees might ask, here are your
Mhm.
answers. Do not deviate from
Yep.
said script, right? It's gone through legal or blah, blah, blah. And a lot of what times what I find is actually the questions are pretty good, right? They've thought about, hey, these are the kinds of things that people are going to ask, but the answers are awful, right? They're this sort of generic, whitewashed, whatever. And what it lacks, and especially if you're an empathetic leader, is it's not an acknowledgement of maybe the responsibility us as leaders have had that have created this situation, or validating the fact that, hey, this sort of sucks, right? Right now, and just sort of meeting people where they are.
Mhm.
And this is where the resonance problem comes in. This doesn't feel right for you, but
Mhm.
you're sort of being told you have to do this sort of work. And it's a simple example, but it's one where you're not feeling it, but then your team knows you're not either. And that's when you get sort of painted with this, okay, this is not resonating with me. It
Yeah.
certainly doesn't seem like it's resonating with you. And that's where this resonance piece and incongruence sort of comes in.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's insidious. You may not even know.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that example actually because it's one of the things that I wanted to actually talk to you about is like you said, a little bit about my personal career. I have been in some of those situations, but I've also been in situations where, as like a company is growing, like on the other side, you have somebody who is on your team that you're either a colleague with or you're trying to manage a greater team and get maybe more potential out of those team members, but you know something is off, right? You can kind of feel it. And I don't know a better way to describe it. I'm sure you can think of some great ways to articulate that, but it is this feeling. It's this nagging kind of not necessarily voice in your head, but like something just different. Like I haven't expressed my thoughts fully. I haven't shared what I really want to share. And it's this incessant voice that kind of hangs in the back until you do. It just feels like you're carrying a little bit of extra baggage along.
I love that. And I think sometimes it's very obvious, like you're saying, but a lot of times it's just not. And you can't even, we talk about in some coaching circles, this thing that called the three levels of reality.
Mhm.
What does that even mean? There's sort of this high level of I can't even put it into words. I just know this is what this thing is. It's like a dog, right? You show pictures of all sorts of different kinds of dogs to kids, and they'll look at them and they're like, "Oh, yeah, it's a dog," and they can tell the difference between a dog and a cat. But when you explain what they are, four legs, furry, whiskers, they sound the same. So there's some inherent dogness and catness that people just get and understand. And that's kind of what you're talking about. Hey, there's this feeling. I know it's real, but I can't even it's not a 2 plus 2 equals 4 kind of thing. That's a fact. I just know it and can't articulate it just quite yet. So happens all the time. And actually getting people to understand these sort of different levels, because you'll have meetings sometimes where people are talking up here at this, it doesn't feel right. And that's
Mhm.
not corporate speak. And 2 plus 2 equals 4. And they're sort of going past one another. And that's where you can also end up in these sort of authenticity issues where it doesn't feel right, but I can't explain it. So I guess I have to discount it.
Right. Well, so how, as you're coaching these leaders and even just, they don't even have to be leaders. Let's just say an individual contributor as well, or a business owner, when you have some of those negative feelings, oftentimes the statements that I'll hear from people are, well, I can't be my real self because, my, legal, like you said, the example, legal won't allow me to say certain things, or, what, this person isn't just going to understand, but I really want to vocalize myself in this way. How do you balance societal boundaries, I think is the word that you used,
Hmm.
with able to express yourself fully? Is that
Yeah.
framing or is that actually being authentic to yourself?
Well, and I think what you're getting at is maybe the second part of this equation that we were just talking about. So we talked about this resonance. Okay, it's not really who I am. But then there's this fidelity piece. And what do I mean by that? And I'm 90% confident I'm going to answer this question by connecting these two dots together. when I was a kid, high school, college, they used to have, you'd go to the mall and they'd have these hi-fi shops, right, where they sold all this high-end equipment. And they'd have these sort of special rooms where they were glassed in and you had this leather couch and they'd have all these different kinds of speakers, Bose speakers, blah, 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 Marantz, different receivers from different companies and equalizers and so on. And they set this whole thing up. They put some vinyl on the turntable, and you sit down and mind blown, right? It's this sort of amazing sound. And that's a whole idea where high fidelity came from was this concept of how do we make sure your experience of what you're hearing is as true to the original as possible. So you buy the stuff, you spend God knows how much money, you take it back to your crappy apartment, you plug it all in, you turn it on, it doesn't sound anything like it did in the store. Right?
Right.
You're like, "Why?" And you're like, "That's because I need to tune to my space," right? I've gotta take the equalizer out, maybe more mid-range, more of this or whatever. If you got like a Sonos play bar now, they kinda do that automatically, you're like walking around your room and it figures out how to do that. But the whole idea is, how do I make sure the output of what it is that I'm hearing sounds as much like the original as possible? But you have to modulate it, right, with these equalizers. And this is the same thing, getting back to your question on what fidelity is. In different situations, my output is going to sound different because of the room I'm in. When I went to my kid's fourth grade classroom, they say, "Hey, Mr. Fonsica, what do you do?" Right? My answer to that question is different from when I present to the CEO and says, "Who's this guy?" All right. In order for them to hear truth of what I do and what I am, I gotta change the message, right? I'm dialing up a little bit more of the humor and I'm dialing down the jargon for the kids, and it's the opposite with the CEO. So I'm using sort of that equalizer, if you will. So, can you be professional? Can you be personal? You can be both, but that's where this fidelity thing comes in. You need to have context, and it goes back to the boundaries we talked about before, and just not, hey, I'm a joke teller guy, so I'm going to do that everywhere. Well, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. I've never thought about in that capacity. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I have, downstairs in our main TV area. Actually, I'm going to use our basement as the example, right? We kind of it's not quite a movie room setup, but it's a room dedicated, centralized around the television. But we use Sonos speakers in there. And when you set up a Sonos speaker, if you've used it, right, you take your phone and you kind of walk around, and it helps scan, but it looks room. So I really like that example. That makes perfect sense to me. But one thing that really comes to mind is I think a lot of people, and this is true for me, when they're trying to find maybe more of their authentic self, they feel like they have to break through this barrier, right? To get to the point where they can actually share at a level where they feel comfortable. And oftentimes in my experience, it seems like people choose the difficult route, right? There's something where they just say, F it. Like, I'm just going to speak my mind because I finally had it. And then once they do, it's this big relief of like, the dam has broken. Now people know who I am. And so Nate's going to start being Nate. Todd's going to start being Todd.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I
yeah.
just fascinating. Does it have to be a big event like that to get people to really feel like, hey, I've shattered this ceiling and now I'm
Mhm.
out open and people know who I am? Or can it happen gradually just by paying attention to certain things?
I love this question. I'm curious because you said, "Hey, it's happened for me." What was your experience? Was it a big event? Was it something small? What was it for you that said, I'm in. This is me. I can't take it anymore."
I think it was a couple. So one, my history of, I was actually kind of at a darker point in my life, and I really, quite honestly, just had to shatter my own ego. I had to
Mm,
be really honest with people. I had to let people into certain things that I was hiding. And the only way I could do that was I needed help. I have another example where I just finally was pushed into a corner where somebody kept sharing something that wasn't true, right?
mm,
About somebody that I actually cared about. And I finally just reached this point where, hey, I respect this other person enough. I really need to speak up because if I'm not, then I'm not really a
mm,
true friend. I can't ignore this anymore. Whereas previously, it wasn't enough to kind of tip me over the edge, right? It was like, okay, you don't really know what you're talking about. I'll kind of let it slide this time. But so those are the two things that come to mind where it really kind of forced my hand in terms
mm.
of my authentic voice coming to the forefront.
Yeah. So I think you just gave the answer that I'm going to give a little framework around what you just said, because I think this is exactly the way I would picture this is, look, you've got this sort of butting up between, hey, this is a core value, belief, identity statement of who I am of, hey, you're right, this is somebody I care about. And if I don't, stand up for them, then who am I, right? I'm not this person anymore. So there's this sort of values versus stakes. The stakes big, right? Or the stakes low, or does it really matter? So here's sort of a framework I would give and something for us to think about and talk more about. When there's low or where there's no stakes, you go, okay, there's no stakes. I can be whoever I am, whatever I want, right? This doesn't impact me, anybody else, whatever, right? I can let it all hang out. When there's low stakes, this is interesting because when there's low stakes, you can think, oh, same thing, low stakes. But if you're being pressured too, and you don't really care, it's not butting up against a value. And so you're like, I'll just go along to get along, right? You pick your battles kinds of things, right? So, and that's the one that's a little bit more insidious. And I think I see more frequently with leaders than anything else is you sort of have this slow march of whatever the environment is that you're in. Well, I can agree to that. It's not that bad. I wouldn't do it, but whatever, right? I could see it. Uh, and it's sort of the slow march. And then, you're 25 years later, you're like, gosh, is this really the person I am? I'm not even sure anymore because, it wasn't some big thing. There are occasional times when it is a huge thing, like, oh, we're going to do something that really is against your values. But if you do something about it, you might lose your job. What if you're a single parent? What if you get mortgages? All this stuff. And you're like, gosh, now I'm being forced to sort of make the choice, like you were just saying,
Yeah.
wasn't a job related one, but it's like how much of a push is this? And
Hmm.
depending on who you are, your time of life, the responsibilities you have, you might be like, okay, I guess I got to do this. What other choice do I have? And
Right.
I remember there was a legal person I was working with once, and the general manager had pushed them really into a corner. I hadn't been in the meeting, but she came to me afterwards. She's like, I guess I agree to this thing, but I feel like I need to go take a shower now. I just feel so awful. And I'm like, okay, this doesn't feel right. And it was one of those that it was legal, right?
Hmm.
Because that's where the manager was kept pushing. Well, tell me where it's illegal. Well, it's not illegal, but it's wrong, right? And in her case, she's like, I'm a single parent, right? You know what? How do I push up against this?
Yeah.
Um, anyway, so I think you have both happening. And I think part of your question was, well, is it always some traumatic or negative thing that pushes you past the, okay, now I'm just going to sort of stand up for whatever this thing is. And I
Hmm.
think, frankly, it can be both. I've seen people where I had some colleagues that her and her husband had been trying to get pregnant for years and just, where's IVF and just all sorts of, issues where it just was not happening. And it's such an emotional roller coaster when you're going through this for 1 year, 2 year, 5, 6, 7 years. Eventually, you get to the point where like, we're going to give up. We're going to adopt. And they're about, 9 months into a process of trying to adopt a child, and she got pregnant. You're like, okay. Anyway, the point of all this is they changed their life around what they had been doing when it came to sort of their work world. He ended up saying, you know what? I was climbing the ladder for the longest period of time. I'm actually going to dial it back. I'm going to part time, do some fractional stuff, and I raise our child. And
Yeah.
so positive stuff can have this happen just as powerfully as negative. And one of the things I actually work with clients on is we kind of do this life or career travel. What are the high points? What are the low points? What are the high points? Because we all have those in life and at work. And one of the interesting things you find out about those extremes is they all have meaning, right? Something really bad happens to you. That's a really meaningful moment. You might not want to ever have had it happen, but it had meaning, right? It changed you in some way or another. Same thing with obviously the peaks. And so those are the kinds of things that usually when take a look at COVID, right? People are working from home and suddenly everybody's like, is this really what I want to be doing with my life? And, commuting and whatever. And um, it's funny, you think about COVID and Zoom calls and remote. Before COVID, if you ever had like a call and there was like a camera and your kids or dog showed up, you were apologizing. I'm so sorry, right? The kid, let me get them out of here. After, when we're in COVID, like, hey, you want to meet my kids? Or
Yeah.
this is fluffy, right? And
That's
what
perfect.
I actually, the positive thing for me around COVID, if there was one, was you were invited into like people's more authentic lives and literally into their homes, right? Than you ever were before. And you got to see Nathan not as, podcast entrepreneur. You have to see Nathan as the dad, the spouse, the whatever. So anyway, I know I went off the farm there a little bit, but yeah, I think both can cause you to sort of take that mask off,
No,
positive or negative.
I mean, that you have so many perfect examples there, and I love the Zoom one because it is true. I mean, I was just on a couple of Zoom calls earlier today. People's spouses are walking through, the dogs are jumping out, and people don't flinch. To your point anymore, it's just kind of like this is me, like, but it took COVID to bring that out of them, right? And it was like, hey, I don't really have another choice. I'm here. I'm showing up. I'm doing my best, but this is a part of my life, and I find that interesting as well because it does seem, I mean, it does seem, but it is, at least in my experience, where it's a journey, right? And I do think, we should pull back the layers of the onion a little bit on this because there is this aspect of when people hear the word authentic, it almost comes across as there's one thing and this is just what defines me, and people just immediately know how they're authentic. But it really is a journey. You really,
Mm.
between those low points and those high points that you talked about, right? They're all based in something. And it could be, here are my morals, here are my ethics, here are the relationships that are important to me. And it's a little bit of self discovery as you go along. And I'm still finding plenty of things where, I have a stronger voice on maybe political views than I used to, but really now I know, hey, really, my family comes first. I'm willing to sacrifice hours of work and maybe chasing success in the grind to spend more time with my kids because now this foundation has become much more important for me. How does that relate when you're really maybe stuck in a corporate environment in the business world? Do you hear that oftentimes with a lot of these leaders and people that are in these types of environments?
Yeah, I think one of the things you're pointing out too is something. There's a difference between core values, beliefs, whatever you want to call them, and sort of acquired. And we get all these acquired values and beliefs, whether it's through our religion, our family, our culture, our politics, time of life, COVID, whatever it might be. And sometimes it's hard to parse these out, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, but there are some core things that seem, and the researchers say are sort of unchanging. And then there's layers of things that evolve. Oh, this is more or less important, but the core is sort of there. So part of doing this work with folks is kind of understanding, well, this is a core thing, or is this an acquired thing? Because one might have a little bit more ability to morph, I suppose, than another. One of the ways we do that is I do this thing called a childhood totem. Almost everybody, not everybody, but almost everybody has something from like their younger years that they still hang on to or hold on to for whatever reason. Could be a picture, could be a toy, could be some kind of totem. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's passed down from generation. I see you nodding, so I'm super curious. Do you have something like for you that like, yeah, actually, upstairs I've got
Well,
XYZ.
I'm embarrassed to say this. I've never shared this before, but I actually, yes, number one, my mom is very nostalgic. So she kept everything from my childhood. And when we moved to Colorado, she sent a bunch of things out, right? Some have meaning for me, some don't, but they meant something for her. And going on a little bit of a tangent, it is interesting because, as an example, my youngest daughter's starting to lose her teeth. And I can never figure out why parents save the teeth of their kids. And now my daughter's losing her teeth. And I'm like, do I keep this? It's really weird because my mom gave me mine. I know this isn't right, but I still want to hold on to it. Like I still want that memory. But to answer your question, yes, I actually have a stuffed animal from when I was a kid that I have given to my son, and it's in his bed, and he doesn't care anything about it. But I go in there every day when I make his bed, and I set the stuffed animal up, and I make sure it's facing the right. And it's very weird because I catch myself doing it, but it has this weird meaning to me that I can't associate with anything else.
Yeah. Okay. So I got to ask you, we're going to dive a little bit into what, well, yeah, what does this mean? What does it bring back for you?
I think just childhood, just innocence, just not just that's a terrible word, but the feelings that emotes of family, not the pressure of being an adult, not the pressures of just being almost free and innocent, if that makes sense. As you get older, obviously, there's so much of life that you're shielded from or you're naive to, and then when you hit a certain age, obviously responsibility piles on. You give the job of a single parent who feels they can't be authentic because they're going to sacrifice their child. I can imagine putting myself in that position.
Yeah.
So I think it's a little bit of that. And then, my father passed away 4 years ago. So, that reminds me of like a core family where all of us were together, right? I have those cherished highlight memories. I had a good childhood. And I like to keep that close because it's a reminder of how I want to structure our family
Mhm.
and represent that to my kids.
Yeah. Oh, it's beautiful. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, there's so much, as I hear you even talking about, there's so much possibility, joy, wonder, right? No judgment space, right? Everything's like, yeah, wow, right? Kinds of time of life. Um, yeah, anyway, so the point is, and we won't deep dive anymore here. Those are the kinds of things I say, okay, well, how does that core show up now? Or does it even have an opportunity to? And there's different situations where it may or may not. And there might be, hey, you know what? I can't bring some of these aspects in this part of my job or my professional life, but I can over here. And usually what I do is I work with clients and we create sort of this matrix of there's a finite number of things that you're doing as a leader. I'm presenting to the board. I'm, leading my team. I'm working this project. I'm doing budgeting or whatever it might be. There's a bunch of small things, but there's probably less than 10 where you could put them in these buckets. And then you could take a look at, hey, where are some of these core attributes of where am I getting wonder from? Right? What does that even look like? Where
Mm-hmm.
am I getting connection? And then taking this matrix and kind of check, oh, you know what? I actually get wonder when we're doing research. That's super awesome. I love it because, things can fail and it's okay because it's research or connection. Yeah, one-on-ones I have with my team, amazing. And then we make this matrix and take a look at it and see how many things are checked off. If
Mm-hmm.
you look at it, you're like, hey, there's a lot of check marks in these boxes. Those are usually the folks that are feeling pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And if you got like one check mark, that's where you start to see this gap of, well, I don't know what it is, but man, when I see it in this picture,
Mm-hmm.
I can kind of see where that gap's coming from. So then we do a little bit of, well, what are options here? Can we do some job crafting? Well, can we take some of these things and have, is there a way to inject that in here? And we just haven't been intentional about it and see what a picture could look like. And is it reasonable with the job, the environment, the culture, the whatever that you're in? If it
Yeah.
is, awesome. Then we got some work to do and off we go. If it's a, no, I'm this person and this culture requires this thing over here. And if I try to move more into this, it's just not accepted. Then we have to make a call. Hey, how important is this to you? Because you might be in a place where you can't change, and now you've got to live with this dissociation for some period of time. Or how do we make a change?
I'm so happy you went there because I just actually, as you were speaking, I wrote a couple of things down. One of those is how much of authenticity is based around self-awareness, right? Because oftentimes, and maybe this is a follow-up, maybe this is a little tangential, but oftentimes I'll hear people say something like, well, this is just me, right? I'm authentic, but this is just me. And I always hear that statement and it just rubs me the wrong way because I believe and I am living proof that somebody can change their life. You can change your, I don't want to say personality, but you can change your core beliefs. You can learn, you can grow, you can experience new things. And a lot of that is just shifting mindset. But there's a lot of people who are like, well, they either hide their true authentic self on one side, or
Yeah.
it just becomes, well, this is me. And then they just tend to be a bull in a china shop, for lack of a better example, where it's just like, you just accept me and that's it. And if you don't like me, you don't like me, and I'm going to move on with my life. But I feel like a lot of that is rooted in self awareness of just understanding the boundaries, like we were alluding to a little bit earlier, understanding yourself, what really triggers you, but also, at Habitual Growth, as an example, we really try to get people to understand their inner potential. And a lot of that comes from being authentic. It comes from, hey, I'm feeling this way because of this thing over here, or I have this belief because of this thing over here. And once you become maybe a little bit more aware, you start to realize I'm doing things, I'm triggered in this way. And that releases a lot of the authenticity we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think it's beautifully said. And for people who are saying kind of what you reference, hey, this is just who I am, accept me or not. Okay, I mean there has to be a choice here of do I want to even go on this journey? And it all does come down to self-awareness, right? Yeah, back to the personality vomiting. Hey, it's just who I am. Okay. I guess I'm gonna make a choice, but you can't then be surprised that people might not react the way that you would want them to. And if you're fine with that, fine. But I think part of a lot of times this is a self-defense mechanism for whatever reason, right? Where people are like, hey, I'm putting up walls and there could be a whole host of reasons of why that may or may not be appropriate for them. But it's not taking this choice to first look inside of, well, is this really authenticity? Yeah, I guess it's who I am. But is this really appropriate, right?
Mm.
It's not like you're going to go to a funeral wearing a bathing suit and everything else. I guess maybe in some cultures you would, but I mean, you're like, well, no, this would be disrespectful. And I can both be somebody who's humorous and somebody who can be respectful. Which one of these is more important here? Maybe I dial down the, humor part from eight. Here's the thing, I work with people. Everybody thinks very binary about everything. I'm either this or I'm that, and that's it. As
Hmm.
opposed to, well, back to our equalizer analogy. Hey, in this situation, I need to kind of dial the humor down from an 8 to a 4, and I need to dial the empathy up from a 2 to a 6. Guess what? I'm a humorous and empathetic person. Both are me, right? But I
Yeah.
just need to modulate a little bit. And that takes a couple of things. Self-awareness is huge, right? Everything you just talked about. You need to know the different parts of yourself. In fact, one of the activities I do with people is, hey, tell me about the different parts of who you are, right? There's still 8-year-old you in there somewhere. I don't know if you want to bring them out or not. There's creative you, there's spouse you, there's runner you, there's, high diver. I don't know what, but they're all there. And we don't necessarily leverage all of them. We think, oh, there's like the angel and devil, right? If you think back to movies or whatever, I mean, they're doing the right thing or they're on, well, there's a whole spectrum of stuff in between. So we sort of just figure out, well, what are those, right? Oh, I really love to cook. All right, when you're cooking how do you show up, right? I don't care what anybody thinks, right? If fail, it's just food, whatever. Well, it's a pretty
Mhm.
different part of you than whatever. So they have to be willing, first and foremost, to go on the journey. If you're not willing to go on the journey, I can't work with
Yeah.
you. You don't want to work with you, right? But if you are, then yeah, we got to go down the self-awareness path and then figure out, okay, there are actually different parts of me that are all still actually me.
Mm.
And so I can be authentic me. Now the question is, which authentic me needs to show up in this situation so that it gets the most, I'll call it the best outcome, right? Whether if you're
Mhm.
presenting to the board that they're going to hear the message, they're going to believe the message, and it's truly you. Because we're all modulating our behavior all the time. And
Mm.
I think when we modulate our behavior in order to fit in, that's when it feels inauthentic. But if you're modulating your behavior so that that true fidelity comes out that we talked about before, then you're all good.
Yeah. You talked about I mean, that's so good. And you talked about something that I have really enjoyed in my own personal career. And I know I speak for Lisa when I see this as well. And actually, I see this in my wife a lot too. We started this journey several years ago of constant learning, constant growth. And it's one of the things that I enjoy the most, which is almost self discovery, right? It is a journey and you forget about these little pieces of you. But as you go experience more things, as we get to have wonderful conversations like this, as I get to meet new, interesting, fun people, you're like, oh yeah, I used to love this. Or, hey, I get goosebumps talking about this over here. Or, hey, this isn't even work. This is just, I understand this is a passion of mine. And you start to really focus the light in that way, if that makes sense,
Yeah.
where this you learn what excites you, what you don't like, and you start to move your life in a direction which gains momentum, which ultimately creates more happiness, joy, fulfillment, however you want to say that in your life. Do you think when do you see this? Maybe a better way of saying, do you see when you are coaching people, working with clients, or walking into organizations that people hear the word authentic and it almost sounds like a fix it term where it's like, well, you have to be authentic. And I know you don't say it in that way, but they
Hmm.
just almost perceive it as like, you're telling me to be authentic, Todd, which means you don't like me and therefore like there's something wrong with me. I have to fix myself and I'm not willing to go on that journey, right? Or whatever that looks like.
Same. I think the way this comes up, if it comes up, is a little bit different than what you just described. I mean, I'm certainly not the person saying you need to be more authentic. What usually ends up happening is somebody's seen a leader that they admire for a whole host of reasons. But one of the words I usually bring forward when they're telling me about this, because they want to aspire to something like this person and they know they're not. And one of the things I'll say is what you just said. They'll be like, "Ah, I don't have another word for it, but they just seem so authentic, right? They just seem comfortable in their skin and they say the right thing, or maybe they don't say the right thing and it's still okay. And I think it's this comfort piece and they really want to have that. Like, how did they get there? That's one way. The other way that shows up is I got this 360 from my boss and they say I'm using humor in the wrong way and or whatever characteristic that is, something that's important to them. And I'm told I'm supposed to be this way now. And that feels really inauthentic to me. I don't know if I can work here. So those are the two ways that sort of this authenticity question comes up. And then I missed the part of your question now. So now that I set that up, now what do we want to do with that?
Well, I mean, let's take those examples. How do you work with people maybe to bring out the authenticity to get them started, right? Because part of you and I talked offline, as our introductory call, just really around, we want people to take action. I think this is a good opportunity to maybe share some of those little steps. But how
Oh, great.
people on both sides of that coin start to say, okay, I see somebody who is, and I use the word confident. To me, that exudes confidence. That's the word that I choose instead of authentic, where somebody may even
Mm.
say the right thing, but they still feel comfortable in their skin. They're still there to back it up. And I've also been on the other side where I actually tell people myself, like I've had 360 reviews and somebody will say, hey, Nate, you kind of operated in this way. And it took me many years to really step back and say, let me listen to what they're saying. Maybe not how they said it, but let me listen to what is they're trying to say, the intention behind it, so I can learn and grow from that. And maybe walk people through a couple of things they can do as they work towards becoming a little bit more authentic in their own mind.
Okay, couple things. You have such good stuff. I should be taking notes and come back at each one of these. So this whole concept you mentioned in the end of, hey, maybe I can really listen with the intent of what it is they're trying to tell me. One of the things I ask people to do is that, and to think about and have as a framework is no one's 100% right and no one's 100% wrong. So if you're getting feedback from somebody and you disagree with a whole bunch of that, fine. Find the 2 to 5% that you can actually agree with. Because guess what? Not everybody is 100% right or wrong. So if they're not 100% wrong, then something in there must be accurate. And I used to do with a boss I had where he would hold up the mirror super, I mean, this was a big mirror. And I would have this emotional reaction like, what? And I'd go back to my office. I remember pacing. I'm trying to tell me blah, 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 blah. And so I don't know if you're that way at all, but I know that one of my triggers is if I'm being super emotional about something I just heard, it's probably because something in there is true. And if
Mm-hmm.
something in there is true, what is it and what am I going to do about it? So the way I would get through that was just what I described. I'm going to say 80% of what Brian said was all wrong, but maybe 20% might be right. What am I going to do with that 20%? And sort of start leaning into. So that's sort of this feedback part of the equation that you were talking about that I really resonated with. So I want to make double down on that whole idea. Now, when it comes to, okay, what do I do with this thing? How do I be more authentic and what does that look like? One of the tools that I ask people to think through is I give them this 2x2 matrix. And I'm a big fan of the 2x2 matrix. I'm an engineer, so you got to break everything down into a model.
Right.
And its authenticity is on one side of this, where it's I feel like I'm being super authentic to myself, whatever that means to you,
Mm-hmm.
or not so much, right? Low and high. The other part of this is comfort. I was really comfortable in this situation, or I was really uncomfortable. Because you can actually be in a really uncomfortable situation and still be very authentic. It's not easy, but it happens. I had a colleague who was getting lit up by our general manager one time, just brutal. And she just kept coming back with the answer, yep, you're right. Our team did that. We're going to get back to you next week and here's what we're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember talking to her later. I'm like, how do you do that, right? Where you can show up in such a confident and authentic place. Well, it's super uncomfortable. I mean, weren't you uncomfortable? She's like, yeah, I was. But my dad told me once, he said, you know what? They can only fire you. They can't hurt you. They can't kill you. You can always get another job. And so that was sort of a framework that she worked from. I'm like, okay, not everybody can, but she did. So I give them this matrix and I said, I want you to sort of, it's like doing a financial audit where you say, where's our money going? I want you to take a week and just fill in this matrix. Hey, what are situations that came up where I felt high authenticity and comfort, right? Just fill in. It was, oh, and this one-on-one, boom. Or, yep, nope, with my boss, I was over here. And now you've got at least this roadmap of situations where you're like, okay, I actually am feeling and showing up fairly authentic here, but not here, and why? And then we
Mm-hmm.
work through that. Well, what do these things have in common, if anything, right? Let's dive into them. And then
Mm-hmm.
ask, well, which one, not all of them, where would you like to lean into the next time this happens? What's the one situation, because you know what's going to happen again, which one do you want to lean into? So then we identify a pattern, we pick a situation we want to work on, and probably the most important part of this is something called in research cognitive rehearsal, right? You can't just say, oh, I'm going to do it differently when the situation shows up. I like to think about like downhill skiers and that, or any athlete that sort of visualize the whole thing in their head over and over and over again. Rock climbers, you name it, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've practiced 100 times before the actual run. And so it's the same thing here. Okay, how do we want to show up? How am I going to feel? Because I'm going to feel defensive. How am I going to not react? Like I'm not going to go, ha, ha, here's the joke, right? And try and deal with it as a way to manage yourself. Nope. Okay, let's work on that and just hammer home this cognitive rehearsal over and over again. Okay, situation comes up. Then we talk about what happened, how'd it go, what was different? Because guess what? It ain't perfect, never is the first time you went through it. So that's really the two-step process. Let's figure out where, let's find a situation, and let's practice.
Yeah. That's oh Todd, I love this conversation. There's so many good things we could talk about. Coping mechanisms, relationships, going deep with people. What you're talking about I think is extremely important. So I want to keep pulling on this one thread and that has to do with how you hear certain things. To me, when you've made the decision to grow and learn, what is being said to you when somebody is trying to be authentic because they love and support you is extremely instrumental in your own personal growth. There's a gentleman, which I've alluded to a couple of times in some of our previous conversations, but he actually talks about, I'll give him a plug because he's a very well known person, but he's significantly changed my life. I mean, for the better. His name is Andy Priscilla. He has a podcast called Real AF. But what he talks about in the example that he gives is he was making a lot of money. He was on the pro speaking circuit
Mm,
and he ran a supplement. He still does it, but he was running a supplement slash nutritional company, but he was like 350 pounds and nobody, because he was successful, would say anything to him. And all of a sudden, one person was like, "Hey, you're fat." And he explains this better than I am. But basically he had this moment where he was like so mad. And he's like, but I had to look in the mirror and realize like I was a fraud. I was telling these people to do all these things, to be healthy, to be better, to go on your own growth journey. And I was completely overweight. And I use this example frequently, but it's true. The person that has changed my life for the better is actually a previous business partner of mine. And when we would get together, he would say things to me because different upbringing, different environments, different all these things. But he was coming from a point of like, hey, here's my perspective. This is what I see on you. But I took it as a personal attack. And it took us a couple of years to kind of work through in full transparency. But all of a sudden, I had this moment where I was like, wow, maybe I should really stop fighting this. Maybe I should listen a little bit. And now I can relay the information. I can have conversations. I can see different perspectives. I can actually coach other people.
mm.
But it really took some hard truths for me, but then also the willingness to open up. And that's where I really feel like a lot of my authenticity journey started, because it finally was this moment of like, hey, I don't have to be so aggressive at somebody. Hey, I can take a little criticism and look internally and look at the things that I can change about myself. And that to me really opened up so much more about life and self awareness and authenticity than anything else I've experienced.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. It's a journey that I think for me has been really hard, right? I think like you, it took a long time for me to be able to say, and I don't know if this is again sort of some kind of upbringing. I'd probably have to spend some time in therapy to figure that out. But it's like, hey, this defensiveness comes from, if I admit this thing, that means I'm some negative whatever, put it over here and then associating that with identity. Wow, does that mean I'm a whatever? And I don't know why I thought that way, but I'm sure that I did. And the irony here is the more that you sort of push back on all of that, you don't grow, but then other people just sort of give up on you, right? And it's kind of like, all right, well, we tried. As opposed to, and I think that's probably where the 20% worked for me. I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to be only 20% wrong. Then we can at least work with that. But once you sort of start down this journey, I think kind of like what you were just saying, you're like, wow, there's all this opportunity to like grow and be a different person. I know as a parent, I'm a much different parent now than I was. I have 4 kids, right? And they span over a bunch of years. And I would say I wasn't doing it very well. And even my youngest, he's like, gosh, you have changed so much, right? And your kid's telling you that. And I'm like, well, I think that's a good thing, right? Because I looked and I'm like, I don't like this or I don't like how it's happening. But that's pretty tough. I don't know. It was really tough for me. And I think one of the defining moments for me is either, like you said, people just sort of giving it to you. And also having this moment where I was asked this question once. Actually, when I was doing coaching training, they said, what can't you be with? Like if you had a client who came in and they were a certain way and you'd be like, nope, there's just no way I could work with this person. And I'm like, oh, that's easy. It'd be somebody who's blah, blah, blah. And they're like, okay, so what part of you is like that? I'm like, what? What do you mean what part of me is like that? It's the people I don't like that I don't want to work with. But it was this really reflective moment. I'm like, yeah, I guess there is this. And you go on this journey of, oh, this is this ugly piece, right? That's still a part of you that you hoped wouldn't be there, but yet it is. And it was sort of that, again, any mirror journey where you're willing to sort of have that moment of reflection and then do something with it is so, I don't know. It feels like it's going to be awful, and in many ways, it's like freaking amazing. And I don't know, unless you've gone to the other side, if you try to tell other people that they're like, it sounds like it would suck. Like it does. And right, it's that meaningful moment. You're like, it was so worth it because now all these things sounds really fruitful. All these things are possible now, but it's kind of true.
It is true. It is true when you start to realize you can direct your life, and it takes a long time to get there. And we're taught how to live in a box. We're taught these are the boundaries and only think this way and only do these things. And it's hard to break out. And I don't have all the answers. I'm not pretending to, but I was just thinking about what you said and how cool that must have felt for you when your youngest was like, you've completely changed. And like, I take that as a compliment. I mean, that sounds incredible because it is a journey. And, I get those compliments every now and then from people, and it's changed how I judge people, if that
Mhm.
makes sense, where it's like,
Sure.
you get it, or we're all on a journey, right? I think one of the memes that I love the most is, I'm going to butcher this, but somewhere along the lines of, when you spend your 20s thinking the world like is all about you, and then you spend your 40s not caring what the world thinks, and then you realize in your 70s the world was never even looking at you anyways, right? And I've always kept that in mind because to me it's like the sooner you realize it's not that people don't care, but they're so busy in their own lives that the judgment actually isn't there. And going back to what you said earlier, it's not this or that. Like, we can be a lot of things, and I think that is probably the one thing I would stress the most, is to be your authentic self. You have to realize I like that, like the receiver, dialing in certain things based on your environment, and your room, and the situation, and the relationships. And as you grow, you can be a lot of things. One thing doesn't define you, but we're taught from such an early age, it's this or that, it's black or white, it's yes or no. And the world and life and growth is so much more than that.
Yeah.
I know that was long winded, but it
No,
leads
it's
me to
perfect.
maybe the final question. What does authenticity lead you to? When somebody really discovers authenticity, where can they go with that?
Where can I go with that? I guess probably a whole different number of different places. But when I think about what do you get from all this, right? And I think it goes back to where we started, and that is this feeling of, I would call it ease. I mean, you mentioned confidence, but just sort of ease with what's happening. I mean, if I go back to this woman who's getting her butt handed to her, she's totally fine, right? And she can show up and say what she needs to say, be professional, and there's just so much ease here that the level of stress, anxiety, this feeling of performative that we have to do in so many situations in order to either fit in, or have psychological safety, or get ahead, or make sure that we haven't screwed something up with our spouse, you name it. That stuff starts to really melt away. And I mean, have you ever seen somebody? It's like the person who is retiring in 2 months and suddenly they're just like, whatever, right? And they're saying whatever. They seem super happy. They know exactly what's going to happen. And you're like, wow, how come we can't be like that all the time? And it's all these stakes we were talking about before. And now you're just like, huh, it really wasn't all that big of a deal. When I worked with a woman who used to work inside the Beltway in DC, and you're trapped in this little world of politics and everything else, and it just seems so, so, so important. And then she leaves and comes to this company, and then, like you just said, realizes everybody else is not talking about this stuff all the time, right? They care a little, sometimes more, sometimes less. But she's like, wow, it was everything before. And I felt that way even leaving the company I worked with that did good stuff, that saved people's lives. And it just
Mm.
felt like everything. And it was all so important. Was it impactful? Yeah, but I left. I'm like, you know what? There's apparently another 8 billion people in the world who are living their lives who have absolutely no idea what this company does, and they're okay, right? And just getting that perspective gives, I think, ease. And when you can have that authenticity, I just think the ease and stress and anxiety just go down a tremendous amount. And you're like, okay, I can be okay here.
That's so good. That was not a word I was going to pull from. I'm so happy you brought that up. And I'm gonna throw this at you. I'm gonna actually tease this out because this is the next interview that I have. But the gentleman that said it to me, it blew my mind. And but it is perfect for what you talked about at ease. And he said, we look at sometimes, imagine you're crossing a river and the river is a mile wide and you're like, I have no idea how I'm going to get across this. You look right, it's a river. You look left, it's a river. Goes on forever. And he was like, and then you take one step and you realize it's an inch deep. And I was like, holy cow. I was like, and he was like, and that's how we treat life. It looks like there's no end in sight, but then you take one step and it's an inch deep and you realize you just can walk across the whole thing. And that's immediately what came to mind as soon as you said the word ease. And I think that's so good. I think it's just a perfect example of what that represents for me. It's that retirement, right? It's like, I've been holding all this stuff in and then I took a step into retirement and I can do whatever I want. And the river's only an inch deep. And now guess what? I can run across it, right?
Perfect metaphor. I love this metaphor. I'm going to steal this like crazy. So if you have attribution for it, let me know, and I'll give the attribution when I use it in the
I'll run
future.
that down for you.
Okay.
I know he had pulled it from something, but I'll run that down for you. But this is it's been phenomenal. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And like I said, I mean, we could have got a number of different ways on this, but authenticity, is one of the foundational pillars that I think really drives people to make decisions subconsciously or consciously. And, just bringing awareness to this, shining the spotlight on it, just sharing your experience and knowledge means so much. So thank you for the time and being here and sharing your
Thank
wealth
you.
of knowledge. How can people find you? How can they follow you? How can they learn
Yeah,
more
yeah.
about?
Yeah, two ways. One, you can go to my website, Thriving 9 to 5. It's the numerals 9 and then TO5.com. But I would really suggest look me up, Todd Fonsica on LinkedIn. There's a lot more. I tend to like video, right? So if you want to watch a 2 or 3 minute kind of snippet of Todd's thoughts on whatever it might be, go find me on LinkedIn. I have a recent rant on return to office, and yeah, take a look at that one. I think that one and my work-life balance, which I hate that phrase, are probably the two most viewed. So yeah, find me on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me there too. Would love to connect.
Awesome. I'm gonna go check those out because I just that you said rant. I can't wait to hear you rant. Boy, I'm sure it's very. It's been such a pleasure, Todd. Thank you again for being here.
My
Really
pleasure.
appreciate the time. We'll tag you in everything that we have as well to make sure people are finding you and directed to all of you and what you're doing. Just because you're such a phenomenal person and coach and instructor, and I know people can learn so much from you. So thank you
All right.
again.
Thank you, my friend.
All right. See ya.